They tell the story of America as if it began with courage, with dreams, with people chasing freedom across an ocean. But there is another beginning, a quieter one, a darker one that didn't arrive on ships filled with hope, but on ships filled with chains, because long before the southern colonies became symbols of tradition, pride, and power, they were something else entirely. They were machines built to turn human lives into profit, and at the heart of those machines was slavery. Imagine standing on a plantation at dawn. The air is thick, heavy, humid. The land stretches endlessly, green and fertile, promising wealth to anyone who owns it. But the land does not move on its own. It does not plant, harvest, or bleed. People do, and in the southern colonies, those people were enslaved. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a side effect of growth. Slavery was the engine. It was the system. It was the backbone that held everything up. The southern colonies were built for agriculture. Tobacco, rice, indigo, later cotton, crops that demanded relentless labor. Not seasonal effort, not part-time work, but endless, crushing physical exhaustion from sunrise to sunset, every single day. Free labor could not sustain that kind of economy. Paid workers cost too much. Indentured servants eventually became free. So the colonies made a decision that would scar generations. They chose permanent human bondage. Enslaved Africans were not seen as people in this system. They were categorized, priced, bought, sold, insured, inherited. Their bodies were tools. Their lives were assets. Their suffering was invisible, as long as the crops kept growing. And what makes this story even more unsettling is how normal it became. Children grew up watching people being owned. Churches preached obedience while ignoring cruelty. Laws were written not to question slavery, but to protect it, to reinforce it, to make it impossible to escape. The southern colonies didn't just tolerate slavery, they perfected it. Every detail was calculated: how much work a person could produce before collapsing, how much punishment was enough to control without killing, how fear could be passed down, generation to generation, so rebellion never felt possible. Families were torn apart without hesitation. A mother sold one way, her child another. A husband sent to a different plantation, never to be seen again. Love had no legal value. Grief had no protection. And yet, despite everything, enslaved people survived. They formed families where they could. They whispered stories, songs, prayers, passing identity through memory when history tried to erase them. They resisted in quiet ways, working slower, breaking tools, holding on to their humanity in a system designed to crush it. This is important to understand, because slavery in the southern colonies was not just about forced labor. It was about control of the mind, control of hope, control of the future. Enslaved people were told they were inferior, that their suffering was natural, that God had chosen this order. And when a lie is repeated long enough, enforced by law and violence, it becomes a reality for those in power. Plantation owners grew wealthy beyond imagination. Their homes were grand, their lifestyles admired, their legacy praised. But that wealth came from stolen lives. Every brick in those mansions, every field of cotton, every shipment crossing the Atlantic, it all carried the weight of human pain. And here's where the story turns uncomfortable. Because the southern colonies didn't collapse under the weight of slavery. They thrived. The system worked economically. That success made slavery harder to question, easier to justify, and almost impossible to dismantle without conflict. When people talk about slavery today, they often treat it as a mistake. A dark chapter that happened because people didn't know better. But the truth is far more disturbing. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew slavery was brutal. They knew families were destroyed. They knew lives were shortened, bodies broken, spirits crushed. And they did it anyway, because profit spoke louder than morality, because power demanded sacrifice, and the enslaved were the ones chosen to pay. This is why slavery in the southern colonies cannot be reduced to dates and definitions. It was not just a labor system, it was a worldview, a belief that some people existed to serve others, that freedom was selective, that humanity could be measured by skin color, and the effects of that belief did not disappear when slavery officially ended. They lingered, they evolved, they reshaped themselves into new systems, new inequalities, new barriers. The southern colonies laid the foundation not just for an economy, but for a hierarchy that would echo for centuries. When we look back at this history, it is tempting to distance ourselves, to say that was a long time ago, to say that's not who we are anymore. But history does not vanish. It lives in structures, in wealth gaps, in social divisions, in unspoken fears and inherited advantages. Understanding slavery in the southern colonies is not about guilt. It is about truth, because a nation that does not fully confront its foundation can never fully understand itself. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. Because behind every statistic was a person, behind every plantation was a stolen life, behind every success story of the southern colonies was a shadow that history tried to hide. And now, finally, that shadow is being seen. They didn't choose slavery because they were cruel by nature. They chose it because it was convenient, because it was profitable, because it solved a problem they didn't want to solve any other way. The southern colonies were sitting on land so rich, it almost felt endless, fertile soil, long growing seasons, perfect conditions for crops the world demanded, tobacco, rice, indigo, later cotton. But land alone does nothing. Land needs hands, strong hands, tireless hands, hands that don't stop when the heat becomes unbearable, hands that don't quit when the body begs for rest. At first, the colonies tried other options. Indentured servants from Europe, poor men and women promised a future in exchange for years of labor. But those servants eventually became free. They demanded land, they demanded wages, they demanded rights. And suddenly the system felt unstable. Freedom was unpredictable. Free people could leave, they could organize, they could refuse. Slavery offered something different, something permanent, a labor force that could not walk away. A workforce that could be owned for life, children who would automatic. Ally belonged to the master the moment they were born. From an economic perspective, it was devastatingly efficient, and that efficiency changed everything. The southern colonies didn't wake up one day and decide to be evil. They slowly trained themselves to ignore evil. They redefined it. They told themselves enslaved Africans were different, less civilized, less capable, less human. This lie made the system easier to live with, because it transformed exploitation into order, cruelty into discipline, and theft of life into business. The plantations grew larger, the profits grew faster, and the dependence on enslaved labor became absolute. By the time anyone questioned the morality of slavery, the colonies were already trapped by it. Too much money depended on it, too much power rested on it. Too many fortunes were built on backs that could not stand up straight anymore. Fear played a role too. Fear that without slavery the entire southern economy would collapse. Fear that free black laborers would challenge white dominance. Fear that equality would mean loss. So instead of imagining a different future, they doubled down. They wrote laws to protect slavery. Slave codes that controlled movement, speech, education, and family life. Punishments that were public, brutal, and designed to terrify. Violence became policy, and still the system was defended as necessary. Religion was bent to justify it. Scripture was selectively quoted. Obedience was preached to the enslaved. Silence was encouraged among the free. Slavery wasn't just accepted, it was normalized. Children grew up seeing whips without questioning them, seeing auctions without flinching, seeing families separate. Ed, as if it were routine. When something becomes routine, it stops feeling wrong. This is the most dangerous part of the story, because the southern colonies didn't just use slavery, they structured their identity around it. Status was measured by how many people you owned. Wealth was displayed through human property. Power was enforced through fear. And once a society ties its sense of worth to domination, walking away becomes almost impossible. But here's what often gets ignored. Slavery was not the only option. Other economies existed. Other labor systems were possible. But they required compromise. They required sharing power. They required seeing workers as human beings. And that was the price the southern colonies refused to pay. Instead, they chose control. They chose a system where resistance could be crushed violently, where literacy could be punished, where hope itself could be treated as a crime. And yet, hope survived, because even in chains, people imagined freedom. Enslaved workers learned the land better than their owners. They developed skills that kept plantations alive. They became the true experts of the economy that exploited them. Ironically, the southern colonies depended entirely on the people they feared most. This contradiction created constant tension, fear of rebellion, fear of escape, fear of losing control. That fear explains the brutality, the patrols, the constant surveillance, the extreme punishments for even small acts of defiance. Slavery was never stable. It was always one act of resistance away from chaos. And deep down, the colonists knew it. That knowledge hardened their hearts, because to admit slavery was wrong meant admitting the entire southern system was built on injustice, and that truth was too threatening. So they chose denial, they chose justification, they chose silence. The southern colonies didn't just accept slavery, they became dependent on it in ways that shaped politics, culture, and identity. Every argument for states' rights, every claim of tradition, every defense of the southern way of life, it all traced back to one decision: to value profit over people. And that decision didn't fade quietly into history. It led directly to conflict, to division, to a nation tearing itself apart. Understanding why the southern colonies chose slavery forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Systems of oppression don't begin with monsters. They begin with choices, small ones, rationalized ones, choices that prioritize comfort over conscience. And once those choices are rewarded, they become harder to undo. This is why this history still matters, because the logic that justified slavery, the logic of exploitation, dehumanization, and economic convenience, did not disappear. It changed forms, it learned new language, but its shadow remains. The southern colonies made slavery central to their survival, and in doing so, they shaped a legacy that would outlive them. A legacy that reminds us how easily freedom can be compromised when profit is at stake, and how dangerous it becomes when an entire society decides that some lives matter less than others. They called it a life, but it was survival, not living, a daily negotiation between pain and endurance, fear and hope, silence and resistance. To understand slavery in the southern colonies, you have to step inside a single day. Not the laws, no, the economics. A single day in the life of someone who woke up enslaved, worked enslaved, and went to sleep still owned by another human being. Before the sun rose, the day had already begun. No alarm clocks, no choice, just the sound of a horn, a bell, or a shout cutting through the darkness. Bodies already exhausted from yesterday forced to move again. Men, women, children, all rising together, not because they were ready, but because they had to be. Food was minimal, enough to keep the body working, never enough to restore it. Clothes were thin, worn, replaced rarely. Shoes were a luxury many never knew. By sunrise, the fields were alive with motion, hands cutting, planting, carrying, backs bent low, eyes down. Every movement watched. Work was measured, not in hours but in output. If you failed to meet it, punishment followed. If you met it, the quota increased. There was no finish line, only more work. The heat was relentless. Southern summers pressed down like a weight on the chest. Sweat burned the eyes, muscles screamed. But stopping was not an option. Pain was expected. Injury was ignored. Illness was tolerated only until it slowed productivity. An enslaved person's worth was tied directly to how much their body could produce. And yet, even inside this cruelty, life continued. People formed bonds. They fell in love when they could. They shared food, stories, laughter, quietly, carefully. They created moments of humanity in spaces designed to erase it. Families existed under constant threat. A child could be sold at any time. A spouse taken away without warning. There was no protection against loss. Every goodbye carried the fear of being final. Night offered no real rest. After hours in the fields, enslaved people returned to cramped quarters, cabins crowded, dark, often cold in winter, suffocating in summer. But this is where something remarkable happened. This is where culture survived. Songs were sung, not loudly, but with meaning. Rhythms passed down from Africa, reshaped under American skies, spirituals layered with coded messages of hope, resistance, and escape. Stories were told, not written, spoken, memories preserved because writing was often forbidden. Elders taught children who they were, where they came from, what they deserved, even if the world denied it. Faith played a complicated role. For some, religion was forced upon them as a tool of obedience. For others, faith became a source of strength, a belief that suffering was seen, that justice, if not found on earth, existed beyond it. This inner life, this emotional and spiritual resistance, was what slavery could never fully destroy. But make no mistake, the system was brutal by design. Whippings were public, meant to humiliate as much as hurt, to send a message that disobedience would be remembered. Runaways faced unimaginable consequences if caught: branding, mutilation, death. And still people ran, because even the smallest chance at freedom was worth more than guaranteed suffering. Women endured a unique cruelty. They worked the fields alongside men. They endured violence. They were denied ownership of their own bodies. Their children inherited their status automatically. Born enslaved. No choice, no escape. Children themselves were put to work early, not allowed a childhood, taught obedience before they learned to read the world. And yet, children Ged. They played when they could. They imagined futures they had never seen. This contradiction, joy inside horror, is one of the hardest truths to accept, because it reminds us that enslaved people were not just victims. They were humans, complex, resilient, creative, strong in ways the system never anticipated. The daily life of slavery was not just suffering. It was endurance. It was adaptation. It was survival against overwhelming odds. Plantation owners depended on this strength while denying it existed. They relied on intelligence they claimed was absent. They trusted people they claimed were dangerous. This hypocrisy was baked into the system. Slavery demanded that enslaved people be strong enough to work but weak enough to control, smart enough to manage crops but not smart enough to deserve freedom. That contradiction created constant tension, and in that tension, resistance grew. Not always loud, not always violent. Sometimes it was a look, a song, a slowed pace, a broken tool, small acts that reminded the system it was never fully in control. When we talk about slavery in the southern colonies, numbers can numb us. Millions enslaved, centuries of exploitation. But understanding daily life brings the reality back into focus. It was not abstract. It was intimate. It was waking up owned, working under threat, sleeping knowing tomorrow would be the same, and still finding a way to feel human. That is the part of this history that refuses to be erased, because despite everything designed to break them, enslaved people carried something slavery could never own: their humanity. It looked beautiful from a distance, endless green fields moving gently in the southern breeze, tall trees lining long dirt roads, white plantation houses standing proud against the sky. But beauty can lie, because beneath that calm surface was an economy powered by pain, an economy that turned suffering into profit and called it success. The southern colonies didn't just grow crops, they engineered wealth, and that wealth came from plantations, massive operations designed to extract the maximum value from human bodies. Plantations were not farms in the simple sense. They were industrial systems, highly organized, ruthlessly efficient. Every acre was calculated, every season planned, every enslaved worker assigned a role based on strength, age, and endurance. There were field hands, working from sunrise to sunset, house servants, always watched, always close to power, skilled laborers, carpenters, blacksmiths, drivers, whose expertise kept the entire system running. Nothing was random. Plantation owners studied productivity the way modern corporations study data. They tracked output, they adjusted workloads, they pushed limits. If a person collapsed, another took their place. The crop didn't care who bled for it. Tobacco was one of the first engines of this economy. Demand exploded in Europe, so did profits. Soon rice followed, then indigo, each requiring intense labor in brutal conditions, and then came cotton. Cotton changed everything. With the invention of the cotton gin, production skyrocketed. So did the hunger for labor. Suddenly, slavery wasn't just profitable, it was indispensable. Cotton became king, and enslaved people became the kingdom's fuel. The southern economy grew rich, fast, ports filled with ships, markets thrived, banks expanded. The wealth didn't stay in the South either. Northern factories processed southern cotton. European mills spun it into cloth. Global trade flourished. Slavery wasn't a regional issue, it was a national one, an international one. And yet, the pain was localized. It lived in the fields, in the overseer's whip, in the quiet sobs of exhausted bodies at night. Plantation owners justified it all with numbers, profit margins, export volumes, market demand. Human suffering was reduced to a cost of doing business. And when something becomes just business, conscience disappears. Enslaved people were worked until their bodies broke, then replaced. No retirement, no compensation, no mercy. Children were trained early to become part of the machine. Elders were discarded once they could no longer produce. The plantation economy thrived on this cycle. It rewarded cruelty. It punished compassion. A kinder owner was seen as weak. A brutal one was considered efficient, and that brutality echoed through generations. The wealth built on plantations didn't just buy luxury. It bought power, political influence, legal protection, social status. Plantation owners dominated Southern politics. They shaped laws to protect their interests. They controlled courts. They silenced opposition. Any threat to slavery was framed as a threat to the economy itself. And in a society built on profit, the economy always wins. But here's the truth that history often hides. The plantation system was fragile. It depended entirely on people it refused to recognize as human. Every harvest depended on cooperation. Every shipment depended on skill. Every profit depended on lives that could resist. That fear of resistance haunted plantation owners. It's why punishments were so public, why patrols were constant, why control extended beyond work into every aspect of life. Slavery required constant violence to survive. Without force, it would collapse. And enslaved people knew this. They understood the system better than anyone. They saw its weaknesses. They exploited them when they could. A broken tool, a slowed pace, a field quietly underproducing. These weren't accidents. They were acts of survival. Despite everything, enslaved people built their own economies within the plantation world, trading goods, sharing resources, creating informal networks of support. Even in bondage, community existed. The plantation system tried to strip people of identity, but identity adapted. Names changed, languages blended, traditions survived in fragments. What the system failed to realize was that culture is harder to destroy than bodies. And that culture carried memory, memory of freedom, memory of dignity, memory of a life beyond ownership. This is what made slavery so unstable, because no matter how profitable the plantation economy became, it was built on resistance waiting for a moment. The wealth looked permanent. The power felt unshakable, but beneath it all was a truth the southern colonies tried to ignore. An economy that depends on dehumanization will eventually face the cost of that choice. The plantations didn't just grow crops, they grew conflict, they grew division, they grew a legacy that would tear the nation apart. When we look at plantation houses today, they are often framed as symbols of elegance, of history, of heritage. But heritage without truth is a lie. Those houses stand because countless unnamed people were worked into the ground to support them. Their stories matter, because understanding the plantation economy forces us to confront a hard reality. Prosperity can be built on injustice, and when it is, the damage doesn't disappear with time. It settles into the soil, into institutions, into memory. The southern colonies became powerful through plantations, but that power came at a cost far greater than anyone was willing to admit, a cost measured not in dollars, but in lives. They called it law, but law can also be chains, rules written not to protect people, but to bind them, to turn flesh into property, to declare that some lives belonged entirely to another. Slave codes were more than regulations. They were a declaration of control, a blueprint for domination, a systematic way to erase humanity while keeping bodies alive. Every colony had them, every plantation enforced them, every master relied on them. Movement was restricted, speech was monitored, learning to read or write was forbidden, religion could be twisted into obedience. Marriage meant little because children automatically belonged to the master. The law didn't protect, it punished. It defined ownership, not justice. Imagine waking up knowing that even the smallest step could bring pain. A word spoken incorrectly, a glance that implied defiance, a footstep in the wrong place. It was a life of calculation, of constant alertness, where every decision carried risk, and yet enslaved people navigated it, learning when to speak, when to remain silent, finding hidden moments to teach their children, to preserve stories, to pass down culture. The codes were designed to break families, to destroy community. But people adapted. They created networks of care, secret gatherings, whispered lessons. They found ways to sustain identity and hope, even when the law was against them. Punishments were public, whippings, branding, even death, all meant to instill fear. Fear that obedience was the only path to survival. And fear worked, mostly. It made some comply. It kept the system running smoothly. But fear could not eliminate resilience, because while the codes controlled behavior, they could not control spirit. Enslaved people resisted quietly. They sabotaged work. They hid food. They taught forbidden lessons. They sang songs with coded messages, warning of danger or whispering hope. Even as the law claimed ownership over them, enslaved people remained the true authors of their own survival. The codes also reveal something uncomfortable. Slavery wasn't just economic, it was legal, it was intellectual. It required careful thinking to maintain power. Those who wrote them understood the threat. They understood the intelligence and ingenuity of the enslaved, and they sought to preempt rebellion with rules that made obedience nearly impossible to refuse. And yet, resistance found cracks. Every law had loopholes, every master had blind spots, every system depended on complicity that could falter. The enslaved learned to navigate both the explicit rules and the unspoken expectations. They discovered small ways to assert autonomy in a world designed to deny it. But the human cost was immense. Parents could not protect their children. Children could not escape the life they were born into. Marriages could not guarantee love or safety. Every personal choice carried consequences. Enses far beyond themselves. The law had become the master's whip. The legal system had become the overseer. Justice existed only for the powerful. And still, life persisted, because enslaved people carried something the codes could never touch: hope, memory, identity, faith, and the belief that freedom, someday, was possible. These laws were a reminder to everyone, enslaved and free, of the balance of power. They reinforced hierarchy, they codified cruelty, they justified oppression, but they also exposed the fragility of the system. A society that depends on laws to enforce morality it refuses to follow cannot endure without conflict. History would prove this true. The codes shaped culture, economy, and politics. They left an imprint that outlived slavery itself. Understanding them is not just about learning rules. It is about witnessing how power can be weaponized, how legality can serve injustice, how people can endure and resist within impossible systems. Slave codes stripped ownership from human beings, but they could never strip identity from the human spirit. That spirit is why stories survived. That spirit is why rebellions happened. That spirit is why the truth cannot be erased, because behind every law was a person, behind every punishment, a story, behind every regulation, resistance. And when we read about slave codes today, we are not just studying history. We are confronting courage in the face of oppression, ingenuity under surveillance, life under systems designed to destroy it. The southern colonies were built on these laws. They grew rich, powerful, and confident, but the human cost was incalculable. And the legacy of these laws, the echo of Contro, fear, and dehumanization, continues to shape our world. Slave codes were more than rules. They were a mirror of the society that created them. And in that mirror, the enslaved saw the harshest truth of all. Freedom was not a given. It was a battle fought every day, in every glance, every whispered lesson, every act of quiet defiance. They were torn apart before they even knew what family meant. A mother holding a child one moment and watching it be carried away the next. A father separated from his own children, sold across a river, a county, or a state. Slavery was not just about work or control. It was about erasing bonds that make us human. Imagine the silence of a cabin after an auction, the empty spaces where laughter once lived, the echo of footsteps that will never return, the weight of absence pressing down on every heart. It was grief that could not be comforted, loss without closure, love without guarantee. Children did not understand why they were taken, why their parents disappeared, why the world treated their families as property. They only knew the ache, the fear, the constant uncertainty that tomorrow could bring another separation. And yet life had to continue. Enslaved mothers and fathers found ways to love in small, stolen moments. A touch, a word, a lullaby, anything that could transmit hope across the distance imposed by cruelty. Some wrote messages in code, some hid letters, some whispered prayers at night that one day they might be reunited. Every act became sacred, a rebellion of the heart. Family separation was not random, it was intentional. Auction houses were instruments of control. By breaking families, slaveholders sought to weaken resistance. They sought to ensure dependence, compliance, and submission. A person without family ties was more likely to obey, but the enslaved resisted this strategy in ways both quiet and profound. They maintained bonds through memory, through rituals, through community networks that substituted for broken families. They created surrogate kinship, adopting each other, protecting each other, teaching the young, comforting the old. Even in the face of law and violence, human connection survived, because love cannot be legislated out of existence. Yet the toll was immense. Mothers grieved children they would never hold. Fathers mourned sons and daughters stolen from them. Siblings were scattered across plantations and states. Even marriages could not ensure unity. This pain shaped generations. The trauma of separation did not end with slavery. It lingered, carried in memory, in stories, in loss passed down. It created resilience, but also scars that would take lifetimes to heal. And within this suffering, moments of courage appeared. People ran away, risking everything to reunite with family. They hid, they escaped, they relied on networks like the Underground Railroad. Every reunion was a defiance of a system designed to destroy connection. Even the small victories mattered. A parent managing to see a child for one evening, a couple exchanging secret letters, a family creating rituals that preserved identity. These moments became acts of resistance, proof that even under the harshest oppression, the human spirit endures. It is easy to think of slavery as economic or political, but the reality was deeply personal. It lived in the hearts of those torn apart, in the cries unheard. In the hands never held again. It transformed human relationships into terrain for survival. The southern colonies built their economy on the backs of families broken by greed. They thought power would silence love. They underestimated resilience. They underestimated hope. Even when separated, the enslaved carried memories of their families. They passed them to children. They whispered names, told stories, sang songs. Each act preserved identity and human dignity. Family separation was a weapon, but it could not destroy humanity. It could only shape it, forge it in fire, bend it, test it, but never erase it. This is why, when we study the southern colonies, we cannot ignore the human cost. It is not numbers or crops or profits alone. It is the silenced cries of mothers and fathers, the absent hugs of children, the invisible wounds that lasted lifetimes. Every plantation, every auction, every sale carried the echo of love lost. And in the shadows of that loss, a community persisted, a culture persisted, a spirit persisted. Because even in the cruelest systems, humans will find ways to love. Even in slavery, families endured. Even in separation, hope survived. And that is the true story behind the southern colonies, not just of profit or law or crops, but of hearts tested beyond measure, of love stretched across impossible distances, and of humanity that refused to break no matter how deeply the chains cut. They said obedience was survival, they said silence was safety, but some refused. Even when chains rattled, even when whips cracked, even when the world told them they had no right to hope, they refused to obey completely. Resistance was never simple. It was an awa. It was a battle with guns or fire. Sometimes it was a glance, a gesture, a hidden message, a slowed pace, a stolen moment to assert, I am still human, I still exist, I still matter. Rebellion took many forms. Some ran, risking death, the law, and capture to seek freedom. Some sabotaged tools, crops, or supplies, undermining the plantation without leaving evidence. Some taught forbidden lessons to children, preserving culture and knowledge the system tried to erase. Every act was a refusal to submit. Every act was defiance, no matter how quiet. And each defiance carried enormous risk. Punishments were brutal, public, designed to terrify. Yet the courage to resist persisted. There were organized rebellions, rare but ferocious, stories of courage that struck fear into the hearts of slaveholders, and countless smaller acts, unrecorded but no less powerful, carried out by ordinary people who refused to allow the system to crush their spirit entirely. Resistance was intelligence. It was creativity. It was survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. The enslaved knew the land, the routines, the vulnerabilities of those in power. They used knowledge like weapons, subtle, precise, life-affirming weapons. But resistance was not just against masters. It was against the system itself. A system designed to claim bodies, silence voices, erase identity. Every act of defiance reminded the world that enslaved people were not property. They were humans. Humans who could think, feel, hope, and fight back. The southern colonies thrived because of fear, control, and obedience. But they also lived in constant tension, haunted by the knowledge that those they enslaved could, and did, resist. No law could fully contain the human spirit. No whip could fully suppress courage. And that courage carried lessons. It showed that even in oppression, humanity cannot be fully aced. It taught future generations that dignity cannot be bought, stolen, or legislated away. It revealed cracks in a system that appeared invincible. Resistance was a whisper that became a roar over time. It inspired escapes, rebellions, and ultimately the fight for freedom across the nation. Every subtle act of refusal, every hidden lesson, every small defiance became part of a larger story. A story the southern colonies could not control. The enslaved demonstrated that survival alone is not enough. True survival requires holding on to one's identity, one's culture, and one's voice. And so, while the southern economy depended on obedience, it was also shaped and challenged by the very people it sought to dominate. Resistance reminds us that history is never one-sided. Even when systems seem absolute, they are tested by courage, intelligence, and the refusal to surrender. Even under the harshest oppression, the human spirit finds cracks, creates openings, and asserts itself in ways no law, whip, or master can fully erase. In the end, resistance was more than rebellion. It was proof that chains could bind bodies, but never fully conquer the soul. Proof that slavery, despite its brutality, could never completely destroy humanity. And proof that one day those whispers of defiance would grow too loud to ignore, shaping the course of history forever. They said faith would save them. They said religion would make obedience easier. But for the enslaved, faith became both a weapon and a shield, a paradox wrapped in scripture, a tool used to control and yet a source of defiance. Churches preached that slavery was God's will, that submission was holy, that suffering was Arved, that obedience was a virtue, and many masters used the Bible to justify cruelty, quoting selectively, ignoring context, twisting belief into chains. Yet, enslaved people found a different meaning. They heard messages of hope, freedom, and justice hidden within the same scriptures. They transformed hymns into coded songs. They prayed for liberation, for family, for safety. They clung to the belief that life was more than labor, more than punishment, more than the ownership of another. Religion became a secret act of rebellion, a quiet resistance against the narrative imposed by their masters. Because when faith is claimed for control, claiming it for oneself becomes revolutionary. Prayers whispered in cabins, songs sung softly in the fields, messages embedded in stories told at night. Every act of spiritual preservation was a refusal to accept that God had sanctioned their suffering. Churches were both places of fear and spaces of solace. Masters expected obedience. Enslaved people sought strength. Every sermon, every hymn, every ritual could be interpreted in two ways, one for control, one for hope, and the enslaved learned to navigate both. Faith also preserved identity. It reminded people of their humanity. It connected them to ancestors lost to the Middle Passage. It nurtured the belief that suffering was temporary and freedom was worth striving for. Religion, in this sense, became a lifeline, a bridge between despair and resilience. But the system of slavery remained brutal. It sought to remove the personal meaning of faith and replace it with submission. It punished those who dared to interpret Scripture independently, those who dared to teach, those who dared to sing in ways that inspired courage. And yet the human spirit persisted. It found ways to bend without breaking, to interpret without betraying, to resist without revolt. Faith under slavery was a mirror, a reflection of the contradictions of the southern colonies. It was used to control, yet it empowered. It was used to justify cruelty, yet it offered hope. It was a tool wielded by oppressors, yet it became a weapon for the oppressed. Through religion, enslaved people built community. They gathered secretly, shared stories, taught morals, and passed on traditions. They reinforced culture and identity, reminding each other that life was more than what was forced upon them. The paradox of faith also shaped resistance. When every action, every thought, every heartbeat was under scrutiny, internal belief became a private revolution. It could not be policed, sold, or destroyed. And that internal revolution sustained hope for generations. The southern colonies, in all their power, could not fully control spirit or belief. Every sermon, every passage, every imposed ritual had cracks, and the enslaved used those cracks to maintain dignity, identity, and courage. Religion under slavery also left a lasting legacy. It influenced songs, stories, proverbs, and cultural memory. It created resilience that survived beyond emancipation. It shaped African American culture, art, and community for centuries to come. Faith became proof that even under the harshest oppression, humans can find strength, meaning, and resistance in the most unexpected places. It showed that chains could bind bodies but not beliefs. It proved that morality and hope can survive, even when laws, whips, and cruelty. Why attempt to erase them? In the end, the story of religion under slavery is not just about control. It is about survival, identity, courage, and the power of the human spirit to find light in darkness. It reminds us that oppression can dictate bodies but not the soul, that systems may enforce obedience, but they cannot fully dictate faith, hope, or inner resistance. And that is why centuries later, we still hear the echoes of songs sung softly in the fields, prayers whispered in the night, and courage carried quietly in the hearts of those who refuse to be broken. They say culture is born in freedom. But what happens when culture is born in chains? When every song, every story, every tradition is carried under the shadow of oppression? In the southern colonies, slavery did more than control bodies. It tried to shape the very identity of an entire people. Yet, even as it imposed hierarchy, cruelty, and fear, culture persisted. The southern colonies' society was built on the principle that some people were less than human. But the enslaved refused to internalize that belief. They sang, they prayed, they danced, they told stories. Even in oppression, they created art, meaning, and community. They nurtured children with a sense of identity that the system tried to erase. Culture became a quiet form of rebellion, a song hidden within a work rhythm, a story passed at night, a dance disguised as celebration. Through these acts, enslaved people maintained memory, preserved lineage, and connected generations separated by laws and violence. Slavery shaped Southern culture beyond just oppression. It influenced language, cuisine, music, religion, and social structures. African traditions blended with forced adaptation to survive under new conditions. The result was resilience and creativity forged in unimaginable hardship. Yet, the influence was double-edged. Southern white culture flourished economically and socially, built on stolen labor and wealth. Southern black culture survived in resistance and adaptation. One side thrived through power and profit, the other endured through endurance, community, and identity. The tension shaped the region for generations to come. The cultural legacy of slavery is layered. It is sorrow and celebration intertwined. It is pain and resilience coexisting. It is a people who, even when denied freedom, created music that would echo across centuries, stories that would inspire, and traditions that would survive systemic erasure. Understanding this is crucial. The Southern colonies' economy and identity were inseparable from slavery. But the enslaved shaped culture in ways the system could not fully control. Faith, music, oral history, family rituals. These became lifelines, carrying memory, courage, and identity across generations. Even after emancipation, the effects persisted. The scars of slavery remained in social structures, economic opportunity, and racial prejudice. Yet the cultural resilience also persisted. African American culture became a testament to survival, creativity, and defiance in the face of centuries of oppression. Slavery tried to dictate every aspect of life, yet culture survived in hidden, enduring ways. Every song, every story, every whispered lesson was a refusal to be erased. Culture became proof that identity and humanity can endure even when the world insists otherwise. When we study the southern colonies, we cannot separate economy from culture, oppression from creativity, pain from resilience. Slavery shaped the South, yes, but it also revealed the extraordinary capacity of human beings to maintain identity, community, and hope under unimaginable circumstances. The legacy is complex. The Southern colonies' history is not just of oppression, but of endurance. Not just of domination, but of resistance. Not just of loss, but of survival, identity, and culture forged in adversity. It reminds us that humanity cannot be fully erased, that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to connect, to create, and to remember. That culture, once born, carries memory and hope forward, even when freedom is denied. And this is the truth the Southern colonies could never fully control. They could dominate bodies, enforce laws, dictate work, and separate families, but they could not dominate spirit, creativity, or culture. Those lived on, quietly, resiliently, powerfully, shaping the present and echoing into the future. Freedom arrived slowly, not with a single moment, not with a single declaration, not without cost. The Southern colonies eventually faced the end of slavery, but ending chains did not end the pain, the loss, the echoes of injustice that had been carried for generations. It was a moment of triumph, shadowed by centuries of suffering. When emancipation came, it did not erase the past. It could not restore families torn apart by auctions. It could not heal bodies broken by forced labor. It could not erase the trauma etched into minds and hearts. Freedom was not a gift. It was a hard-won victory after unimaginable endurance. The Southern colonies,